The morning rush at Grant and Foster Industries was a familiar storm. Executives in tailored suits darting through glass corridors, the echo of heels and cell phones filling the air. At the center of it all was Richard Foster, the CEO, confident, polished, and utterly consumed by his world of deadlines and deals. To Richard, the world ran on hierarchy. Every person had their place. And at the very bottom of that invisible ladder stood Henry Wallace, the janitor. Henry had been working in that building for almost 10 years. He was quiet, steady, the kind of man no one really noticed, except when the floor gleamed a little brighter or the trash disappeared like clockwork. His uniform was always pressed, his back always straight. He carried himself with a calm dignity that somehow didn't fit the role most people assigned him. To Richard, he was just another part of the background. "Morning, Mr. Foster," Henry said one day, pushing his mop bucket across the marble floor of the lobby. Richard barely looked up from his phone. "Yes, yes, good morning," he replied, distracted, stepping around the man without making eye contact. Henry smiled anyway. "Be careful there, sir. That corner gets slick." But Richard was already gone, his mind on profit margins, not people. That afternoon, a major investor meeting was scheduled. Richard stood in the boardroom rehearsing his presentation when he heard the faint creak of the door. He turned sharply. "Hey, you can't just walk in here," he snapped. Henry froze in the doorway, holding a trash bag. "Sorry, sir. I'll come back later." Richard sighed loudly. No, just make it quick. But please, next time, knock. We're preparing for a meeting worth more than your annual salary." The words hung in the air, sharp and unnecessary. Henry simply nodded. "Understood, Mr. Foster." He didn't look angry, just quietly sad. When he left, Richard noticed something odd. The man had paused at the door, glancing at a photo on the wall. An old picture of Richard shaking hands with his late father, Charles Foster, the company's founder. For a moment, something flickered in Henry's expression. But Richard didn't notice. He never did. He had no idea that the janitor he'd just humiliated knew more about his father, and about the man Richard used to be, than anyone left in that building. Because once, long before the suits and skyscrapers, before Richard became Mr. Foster, Henry Wallace had been Charles Foster's best friend. And before the week was over, that truth, hidden for decades, would bring Richard's entire world crashing down. The following morning started like any other. Richard barking orders, assistants scrambling, phones ringing, and Henry quietly mopping around all the chaos. But something subtle had shifted since that boardroom moment. Richard had noticed how the janitor had lingered on that old photograph of him and his late father. Something about it tugged at him, though he couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way the man had looked at it. Not as an employee might look at a boss's legacy, but as someone remembering a friend. Later that day, the company was preparing for an event, a gala celebrating what would have been Charles Foster's 70th birthday, honoring his contributions as the founder. Richard had ordered the maintenance team to polish every inch of the building. As Henry dusted the portraits along the main hall, one of the younger interns, Jason, walked by and chuckled. "You missed a spot, old man." Henry just smiled faintly. "I'll get it on the next pass," Jason sneered. "Man, I don't know how you do this. Cleaning floors while people like us run the show." Henry replied quietly, "Son, you learn a lot about people when you're not the one talking." Richard overheard the exchange as he stepped out of the elevator. "Jason, enough," he said sharply. "We've got bigger things to worry about." Jason muttered an apology, but Richard's tone wasn't for him. For some reason, the janitor's calm response stuck with him. When the evening came, the gala began. The company's top executives mingled with investors under chandeliers and champagne light. A large banner hung across the room, honoring the legacy of Charles Foster. Henry, dressed in his same blue uniform, quietly moved through the room, refilling glasses and clearing plates. Nobody saw him, not really. But when he passed by the memorial table at the front, his hand paused over a framed photo of Charles, shaking hands with a younger man at an old workshop. He smiled sadly and whispered, "You old fool." Still changing lives. Unnoticed by him, Richard had been standing nearby, half listening. "You knew my father?" he asked, suspicion lacing his voice. Henry froze. Then he turned, his expression unreadable. "Yes, sir. long before all this. We grew up in the same neighborhood, worked together before he started this company. Richard frowned. That's impossible. My father never mentioned you. Henry gave a small, knowing smile. Charles was a good man, but he didn't talk much about the early years. We built things in a garage, before all the suits and offices. The CEO's voice hardened. You expect me to believe that my father's best friend ended up cleaning floors in his company? Henry met his eyes calmly. Life takes people different directions. Your father and I took ours. But he never forgot where he came from. I stayed close to what I knew, working with my hands. He always said that was worth just as much. Richard scoffed quietly, but something in the old man's eyes silenced his next words. Sir, Henry added softly, your father was proud of this place, but not because it made money. He built it to give people like me, and you, a chance to build something honest. Richard stood still, stunned. For the first time in years, someone had spoken about his father not as a legend, but as a man. And standing there, surrounded by the glittering room his ego had built, Richard felt something he hadn't in a long time. Small. He turned to look again at the photo of his father smiling beside the younger Henry, both of them covered in grease and dust, holding a wooden prototype of what would become the company's first product. And suddenly, for the first time, he realized that his father's legacy wasn't hanging on the walls or printed in the brochures. It was standing quietly in front of him, mop in hand, wearing a name tag that read, Henry Wallace. The next day, Richard couldn't focus on anything. Not the meetings, not the charts, not even the new investors waiting for his approval. His mind kept replaying that image. His father and the janitor, side by side, smiling like equals. By noon, he finally gave in to the growing weight in his chest and went down to the maintenance wing, a place he'd never bothered to visit before. It was quiet there. The hum of cleaning machines, the scent of disinfectant, the faint clatter of tools. He found Henry sitting on a small stool near the supply shelves, repairing a broken vacuum. The man looked up, surprised but not nervous. Mr. Foster, he said with his usual calm tone, didn't expect to see you down here. Richard hesitated. I wanted to talk. About my father. Henry nodded, setting the tool aside. Then sit down, son. Standing like that just makes a man look like he's hiding behind his pride. Richard blinked. No one had spoken to him that way in years. But he sat. Tell me how you knew him, Richard said quietly. Henry leaned back, eyes soft with memory. Charles and I met in high school. He was the dreamer. I was the fixer. He'd come up with wild ideas, and I'd make them work. We built his first machine in my mother's backyard, the one that started all this. Richard frowned. My father never mentioned that. Henry smiled sadly. He didn't talk about himself much. He was proud of you, though. Used to keep your report cards pinned on the wall of his workshop. The words hit Richard like a blow. He did? Every single one, Henry said. He'd point to your name and say, that boy's going to be twice the man I ever was. Richard's eyes stung unexpectedly. He always seemed so hard on me. Henry nodded. He was tough because he wanted you strong, but he never wanted you cold. There's a difference. For a long moment, silence filled the room, the kind of silence that carried understanding. Then Henry continued, voice softer now. After your mother passed, Charles changed. He threw himself into the business. I stayed with him as long as I could, but when the company grew too big, I didn't belong in the boardrooms anymore. Still, I couldn't walk away. So when this janitor job opened, I took it. Not for the paycheck, for the memories, for him. Richard stared at him, speechless. The thought of this man, his father's best friend, cleaning floors in his company out of loyalty, not need, was almost unbearable. Why didn't you tell me? He asked finally. Henry smiled. Would you have listened? The question landed like a stone. Richard lowered his gaze. Probably not, he admitted. Henry reached over, resting a rough, steady hand on his shoulder. Then you're listening now. That's what matters. When Richard finally left that basement, he didn't feel like a CEO. He felt like a son, one who'd spent too long chasing his father's name without understanding the man behind it. That night, he stood in his office long after everyone had gone home, staring at that same photograph on the wall. His father and Henry, two men with calloused hands and honest hearts. He realized something his degrees and his money had never taught him. Greatness doesn't come from power. It comes from purpose. And for the first time, Richard Foster wanted to earn his father's legacy, not inherit it. The following week, the company buzzed with rumors. Employees had seen the CEO and the janitor in deep conversation, walking through the lobby together as if equals. For a place that lived and breathed hierarchy, the sight was nothing short of unbelievable. Some whispered that Henry was being fired. Others said he was being promoted. But no one knew the truth. Not yet. Richard spent days reflecting, going through old boxes in his father's storage unit, piecing together the life of the man he thought he'd known. Inside one battered metal trunk, he found letters, notes, and blueprints, all signed CF and HW. Every design, every early sketch of the machines that launched the company bore two sets of initials, his father's and Henry's. He sat there in the dust and dim light, staring at the blue ink that told the real story of Grant and Foster Industries. It hadn't been built by one man's vision. It had been built by two men's friendship. When he returned to the office, he called an all-staff meeting, something he hadn't done in years. The employees gathered in the atrium, murmuring in confusion. Richard stood on the balcony, his usual cold confidence gone, replaced by something humbler, truer. "I owe you all the truth," he began, "and I owe one man more than I can ever repay." He gestured toward the side entrance, where Henry walked in quietly, still wearing his janitor's uniform. The room fell silent. "This company," Richard continued, "wasn't founded by Charles Foster alone. It was built with his best friend, a man who worked beside him, believed in him, and stayed loyal long after anyone else would have walked away." He paused, looking at Henry. "Mr. Henry Wallace, my father's partner, his brother in all but blood, and the heart of this company." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Henry looked overwhelmed, his hands trembling slightly. "I once treated him like a servant," Richard went on, voice thick with emotion. "But I've learned that titles and paychecks don't define a man's worth. Character does. And this man's character built the foundation we stand on today." Applause began softly, then grew into a thunderous roar. People stood clapping, some even wiping tears from their eyes. Henry tried to speak, but his voice cracked. "I don't need recognition," he said quietly. "Your father and I did this for the work, not the praise. But I thank you, son. Not for what you said, but for finally seeing me." Richard smiled through his own tears. "Then let's honor both of you. Together." He walked over, shaking Henry's hand firmly. "From today forward, you're no longer our janitor. You're our company historian and ethics advisor. You've taught me more about leadership in a week than any business school ever could." The crowd erupted again, this time with joy. Henry looked down, shaking his head in disbelief, then up at the portrait of Charles Foster hanging above them. "Guess we did all right, old friend," he whispered. Later that night, when the building was quiet, Richard stood beside Henry in the lobby. The lights reflected off the marble floor, and for once Richard didn't see his reflection. He saw his father's smile and Henry's calm strength beside it. "You know," Henry said softly, "your father used to say, 'Success means nothing if you forget the hands that helped you climb.'" Richard nodded. "Then I've got a lot of remembering to do." Henry chuckled. "Then start tomorrow. Floors still need mopping." Richard laughed for the first time in a long time. "Then I'll grab a bucket." For the first time, they walked side by side, no titles, no distance. Just two men, finishing a story that had started decades ago in a dusty old garage. And as they left the building together, the city lights outside shimmered like quiet applause for friendship, for forgiveness, and for a legacy finally set right. Spring came softly that year, bringing sunlight through the glass towers of Grant and Foster. For the first time in decades, the company felt alive again. Not just successful, but good. The tone had changed. Richard no longer walked through the halls with his eyes glued to his phone. He greeted people by name, stopped to ask about their families, and, more than once, helped Henry carry cleaning supplies just to talk. It had been months since the night of the gala, but The moment never faded. The photo of Henry and his father now hung in the main lobby, framed in gold, beneath a plaque that read, "Built with hands of work, held by hearts of friendship." Every new employee who walked through those doors learned the story. And Henry, now sitting in an office marked Ethics and Legacy Advisor, became a quiet mentor to anyone who needed guidance. He didn't trade his uniform for a suit. He just added a badge. He said he didn't need a new outfit to remind people who he was. One afternoon, Richard found him in the workshop the company had rebuilt in the basement, the same space where his father's first prototype had been recreated. Henry was there, oiling an old machine part, humming softly to an old blues tune. "Still fixing things?" Richard teased. Henry smiled without looking up. "Old habits die hard." Richard leaned against the doorway. "You know, I used to think leadership was about control, about being the smartest person in the room." "And now?" Henry asked. Richard's voice softened. "Now I know it's about being the one who listens the most." Henry chuckled, glancing over his shoulder. "Sounds like something your father would have said." "He learned it from you," Richard said. The older man shook his head. "Nah, your father had that wisdom long before me. I just reminded him not to lose it. Guess I had to do the same for his son." They both laughed quietly. Then, Richard reached into his briefcase and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a document, notarized, official. He handed it to Henry. "What's this?" Henry asked, opening it slowly. "It's an amendment," Richard said. "Your name, on all the company's founding papers. The way it should have been from the start." Henry's hands trembled as he read it. "Son, I didn't do this for—" "I know," Richard interrupted gently. "But it's time people see the truth. The story of Grant and Foster started with two men. It's only right it ends with both of their names side by side." For the first time, Henry had no words. He simply reached out, resting a hand on Richard's shoulder. The same gesture he'd used months earlier in the maintenance room. "Your father would be proud," he whispered. Richard smiled. "So would mine." That evening, as the sun set over the city skyline, the two men stood by the window of the workshop. Outside, the world went on. Busy, loud, endless. But in that quiet corner, surrounded by the hum of machines and the ghost of friendship reborn, they stood as equals. And in the reflection of the glass, Richard didn't just see a CEO and a janitor. He saw a father's dream come full circle, and the friendship that had built it standing strong once more. Sometimes, legacies aren't about what we build, but about the people who help us remember why we built it in the first place. And as Henry turned off the lights and they walked out together, the faint echo of laughter, his father's and Henry's, seemed to linger in the dark, reminding them both that some bonds outlast time itself.